I will never forget that sound. Not a scrape, not a knock, but a crunch. A dry, frozen crunch of snow under the weight of something very heavy. I was standing by the window, staring into the ink-black darkness, trying to convince myself it was just a dog or a drunk who'd lost his way. But the snow didn't lie in the morning. The footprints were there. Huge, bare footprints. The strangest part was this: they didn't lead to my porch. They started right at the threshold of my entryway and went straight into the forest. Whatever I heard that night hadn't tried to get into the house. It was leaving it. My name is Alex Morozov, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the winter of 2016, in a half-abandoned village somewhere in northern Pennsylvania. If you think loneliness means peace, you're wrong. Sometimes loneliness is having no one around to confirm that you're not losing your mind. Get comfortable. Turn off the lights. This is a true story. That year, I needed to disappear. The city was suffocating me, a divorce, trouble at work, constant noise. I wanted silence so deep it rang in my ears. On a rental site, I found a listing: a rustic log cabin, forest edge, wood-burning stove. The price was suspiciously low, the photos blurry, but it promised no neighbors for miles. Perfect for resetting over the holidays. The owner, a nervous man in his late 50s named Harold, met me at the turnoff to the village. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he was late for something he couldn't miss. During the drive down the unplowed road, he barely spoke. The village was dying. Out of nearly 40 houses, maybe 6 looked lived in, all clustered near the center. Mine stood alone, right at the forest line, separated from everything by a wide, snow-covered field. The cabin was solid but bleak. Darkened wood, tiny windows, heavy shutters. Inside, it smelled of dry dust and bitter herbs. The stove works. Firewood's in the shed, Harold said quickly, not taking off his coat. Cell service is bad. If you need signal, go up the hill. He placed the keys on the table and looked at me strangely. There was no hospitality in his eyes. It felt more like pity. Or relief that he wasn't the one staying. One more thing, he hesitated at the door. At night, lock both doors. Not just the front one. The inner door too. Use the bolt. Break-ins? I smirked. Just do it, he snapped. And if you hear something outside, don't go out. Woods are close. Animals. Sleepwalkers. Who knows? He left so fast his old pickup nearly got stuck in a snowdrift. And I was alone. The first day was perfect. I chopped wood, stoked the stove, walked to the edge of the forest. The silence was absolute. No cars, no voices, only wind in the pines. That evening, I cooked dinner, poured a glass of whiskey, and read by the crackling fire. The tension of the past months melted away. I even laughed at Harold's warning as I looked at the thick iron bolt on the inner door. Who was there to be afraid of? Everything changed on the second night. January 5th. The night before Epiphany. The weather turned by evening. Wind howled, the old cabin groaned and creaked as if complaining about the cold. I went to bed around midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the dark, listening to snow thrown against the windows. Then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Wind plays tricks. But the sound came again. Crunch. 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 Slow, heavy, rhythmic steps beneath my window. Someone was circling the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding in my throat. The clock read 2:15 a.m. locals. No one walks out here in a blizzard for fun. Remembering Harold's words about animals, I crept to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Outside was nothing but swirling white. Clouds hid the moon. I saw only snowdrifts below the glass. No one there. But the moment I let the curtain fall, the crunch came again. This time right against the wall, at the head of my bed. Someone was standing there. The sound was too heavy for a normal person. Or the person was enormous. Then the steps moved toward the porch. Slow. Confident. The first step creaked. Then the second. The third. The old boards bent under the weight. I backed into the center of the room and grabbed the iron poker from the stove. One thought screamed through my head: the inner door was bolted. But the outer door? I'd locked it with a cheap deadbolt. The handle of the outer door rattled. Metal clinked. Silence. Then came the long, aching creak of hinges. The door opened. Cold ran down my spine. I knew I'd locked it. I remembered turning the key. Now the only thing between me and whatever had entered was the wooden inner door and the bolt Harold had warned me about. Footsteps echoed in the entryway. But they sounded different now. Not the crunch of snow, but wet slaps. Heavy, soggy sounds against wood, like someone had come in with feet packed with melting snow. Or barefoot. I stood frozen, gripping the poker until my knuckles burned. I could feel icy air seeping through the crack beneath the door. The thing stopped right outside. I heard its breathing. Not an animal snort, but deep, rasping breaths with a wet gurgle, like a man drowning in his own lungs. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm armed. I have a gun." I lied. No answer. The breathing grew louder. Then the handle of the inner door began to turn. Slowly. Deliberately. The door was bolted, but the movement of the handle alone paralyzed me. This wasn't wind. This wasn't an animal. Someone stood there in the cold darkness, wanting to come into the warmth. The handle hit the stop, jerked twice, and went still. Then something heavy leaned against the door with its full weight. The boards groaned. I stumbled back, nearly falling. "Go away!" I screamed. The pressure vanished. Silence. I stood there for hours, listening to every sound. The wind died down. The night passed. Gray dawn seeped through the curtains, making the room feel even more lifeless. When the sun finally rose, fear gave way to anger and confusion. A drunk? A vagrant? But how did he open the lock? I decided to check. Poker in hand, I slid back the bolt and flung the door open. The entryway was empty. Cold morning air hit my face. The outer door hung wide open, swaying in the breeze. I stepped inside and froze. On the floor where the visitor had stood was a puddle of dirty meltwater. And in the center of it lay a mitten. A small, red, knitted child's mitten, its elastic torn loose. It was soaked through and smelled of swamp water. Where did a child's mitten come from? I was alone. I had no children. The house had been empty when I arrived. I stepped onto the porch, expecting to see boot prints. The snow was pristine. No tracks from the road. None from the forest. None from anywhere. My scalp prickled. I looked down. The footprints were there. They began right at the threshold, emerging from the puddle inside the entryway. Huge, bare human footprints with unnaturally splayed toes. But the worst part wasn't their size. They didn't lead to the house. They led away from it. A line of deep, clear prints descended the steps and went straight into the forest. There were no tracks approaching the cabin. My mind refused to process it. Whatever it was hadn't come to me that night. It had already been there. Inside the house. Maybe in the entryway. Maybe in the attic, whose hatch was right above it. All night long, while I slept behind that door, it had been nearby. And when the door opened, it hadn't entered. It had been leaving. But why try to break into the room first? To say goodbye? Or to check if I was awake? I remembered the breathing. The turning handle. I ran. I grabbed my keys, my jacket, my documents. Everything else I left behind. On my way out, I glanced once more at the puddle and the mitten and noticed something I'd missed before. On the inner door, at face height, were scratches. Deep grooves in the old wood, sap still oozing from them. Fresh. I jumped into my car and floored it. The engine roared through the snow, but it felt too slow. I watched the rearview mirror, expecting to see something running after me. There was nothing. Only the empty house and the trail of footprints disappearing into the trees. When I reached the highway and signal returned, I called Harold. "I'm leaving," I said the moment he answered. "Keys are under the mat. Keep the money." Silence. "Did you find something in the entryway?" he asked quietly. "A mitten," I said. "A child's. And footprints. Bare footprints leaving the house." He exhaled shakily. "That's Daniel," he whispered. "The previous owner's son. He vanished in the woods 30 years ago, on Epiphany. They searched for a week. Found only a mitten." "Who was in the house?" I yelled. "What walks there?" "Don't go back," he said. "Forget the place. They come to warm themselves sometimes. But they always go back to the forest. You were lucky you bolted the door." He hung up. I drove home shivering, even with the heater blasting. The image stayed with me: clean snow, pale sunlight, and bare footprints forming out of nowhere just to vanish into the trees. I never rent houses in villages anymore. And now, even in my city apartment on the 10th floor, I check my front door every night before bed. Not to make sure no one gets in, but to be certain that nothing gets out while I'm sleeping. Good night. And don't stay up too late. I will never forget that sound. It wasn't the growl of an animal, and it wasn't the creak of old wood. It was the sound of air bubbles bursting as they passed through vocal cords filled with water. A wet, sloshing whisper that drifted out of the darkness where, by every law of physics, nothing living should have existed. I shone my flashlight downward into the black mouth of the earth, expecting to see the bottom or maybe trash. Instead, the beam caught a face. My face. It was staring up at me from a depth of nearly 60 feet, smiling while I screamed. Many of you have heard stories about cursed places, but what I'm about to tell you is not a legend. This happened to me in the summer of 2008, near a dying settlement outside Voronezh. And if you're alone in the room right now, you might want to turn on a night light. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Turn off the lights. This is a true story. The summer of 2008 was remembered by everyone for its abnormal heat. In the cities, asphalt softened and warped like black chewing gum. In the countryside, grass burned down to brittle yellow straw, ready to ignite from a single spark. It was that August when I decided to return to my grandmother's house. The village was called Birch Hollow, though there hadn't been a birch tree there in years. Only dry scrub, leaning fences, and collapsing sheds remained. I hadn't been back in over 20 years. After my grandmother died, the house was locked up and forgotten, and now my parents had finally decided to sell it. My task was simple: arrive, assess the condition, throw out the junk, and prepare the paperwork. I arrived late in the evening. The sun was setting, staining the sky a disturbing shade of dark red. The village looked abandoned. Out of 30 houses, maybe 2 or 3 showed any signs of life, and even there I saw no people. The silence was so complete that the ringing in my ears sounded like a roar. I drove into the yard, killed the engine, and stepped out. The heat hadn't faded even at night. The air was thick with dust and smelled of dried wormwood and old wood. The house greeted me with the smell of stagnant time. You know that smell. Old newspapers, mouse droppings, and dust that hasn't been disturbed for years. I tossed my bag onto the couch and stepped out onto the porch to smoke. That's when I saw it. The well. It stood at the far edge of the property, right where the yard met the forest. The wooden frame was blackened with age and rain, and the small roof above it leaned crookedly, like a drunk's hat. I remembered it from childhood. My grandmother never let me go near it. "Don't look down there, Anna," she used to say, crossing herself. "That water is stagnant. Dead. It calls to those who are alone." As a child, her words terrified me. At 32, they felt like nothing more than rural superstition. I walked closer. The grass around the well was strangely tall and green, completely unlike the scorched earth surrounding it. It made no sense. There hadn't been water in the village for nearly a decade. All the wells were supposed to be dry. I kicked at the rotten boards nailed across the opening. With a sharp crack, one of them collapsed inward. I expected a splash or the hollow thud of wood hitting a dry bottom, but there was no sound at all. Just silence. As if the well had swallowed it. Instead of going back inside, I felt an odd urge to remove the rest of the boards. There was something about that black opening. Something magnetic. Hypnotic. I tore off another board. Then another. Until the dark mouth of the well lay fully open. Cold, damp air rose from below, carrying the smell of wet silt and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. I remember thinking, "I'll seal it properly tomorrow." That was my first mistake. I didn't close it right away. I left it open overnight, as if inviting whatever lived down there to breathe fresh air. I went back inside, locked the door with the flimsy latch, and lay down on the bed fully clothed, on top of the dusty coverlet. The heat was unbearable, but I was afraid to open the windows. The silence outside pressed in too heavily. I fell into a thick, sticky sleep. A few hours later, I woke up. The temperature in the room had changed. It was cold. I sat up, listening. The house, which had creaked inside as it cooled earlier that night, was now completely silent. But through that silence came a sound that did not belong there. Drip. 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 The heavy, rhythmic sound of water falling. At first, I thought a pipe had burst somewhere, but then I remembered, the plumbing had been disconnected for decades. The sound wasn't coming from the kitchen or the roof. It was coming from outside. From the yard. I stood up, trying to move quietly, though I had no idea who I was trying not to wake. The floor was icy under my bare feet. I went to the window facing the yard and carefully pulled back the curtain. The moon was bright, flooding the yard with pale, lifeless light. My car stood where I'd parked it. The shed gaped black through its open door. And the well. Something was wrong. The ground around it looked wet. It glistened in the moonlight, as if someone had poured buckets of water there. But it hadn't rained in over a month. I stared at the dark patch, my stomach tightening. My mind insisted on logic. Condensation. Temperature change. But something deeper, older, screamed at me not to go outside. Curiosity is a terrible thing. Or maybe it wasn't curiosity at all. Maybe it was the same influence my grandmother had warned me about. I grabbed the powerful flashlight I'd brought with me, pulled on a sweater, and stepped onto the porch. The air outside had changed. The heat was gone, replaced by a thick, swampy dampness that soaked into my clothes almost instantly. I aimed the flashlight at the well. The ground around it was truly saturated. Mud squelched under my sneakers as I took a few steps closer. "Is anyone there?" I called. My voice sounded weak and ridiculous. Silence. Only the distant rustle of leaves from the forest. I stepped right up to the wooden frame. The wood was wet, slimy to the touch. I knew I shouldn't do this. I knew I should turn around, get in the car, and leave. Instead, I leaned over the black opening. I switched the flashlight to full power and aimed it straight down. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing moss-covered brick walls. Deep. Very deep. At least 50 feet. And then I saw it. Water. Black, oily water. Perfectly still. Like a mirror. I stared into that black mirror, trying to see the bottom, and then I realized something was wrong. My reflection didn't match my movements. I was leaning forward, gripping the edge of the well with both hands. But the reflection wasn't gripping anything. Its arms hung limp at its sides. My heart skipped. Slowly, trembling, I lifted one hand and waved. The reflection did not move. I was frozen. I wanted to pull back, but my feet felt fused to the wet ground. I stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back at me with my own face. Then the reflection began to change. The features melted, like wax near a flame. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, far wider than any human jaw should allow. And from deep within the well, amplified by the stone shaft, a sound rose up. Aina. It was my name. But the voice. God, that voice. It sounded like mine, but as if I were speaking with my mouth full of water. Bubbling. Wet. Vibrating. Not produced by vocal cords, but by gas bubbles bursting on the surface of rotten water. Si cum duoon, to you us. The flashlight flickered. Once. Twice. I shook it in panic, but the beam faded, shrinking into a pathetic yellow dot. That's when I heard the sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. A slap. A wet slap of flesh against stone. Somewhere halfway up the shaft. Something was climbing. I stumbled back, tripped over my own foot, and fell into the mud. The flashlight flew from my hand, rolled, and for a split second illuminated the edge of the well. A hand emerged. Pale. Bloated from water. With long, broken nails. It latched onto the rotten wood with such force that splinters burst outward. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the house. Behind me came a heavy, soggy sound, like a massive sack of wet clay being dropped onto the ground. It had gotten out. I slammed the door behind me and fumbled with the latch, securing it with shaking hands. Then I wedged a chair under the handle. My heart was pounding so hard my ribs ached. I pressed my back to the door and listened. Outside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Then the footsteps began. Slap. 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 Bare, wet feet on wooden porch steps. Slow. Heavy. Water dripped from the creature. I could hear it splashing onto the boards. It stopped right outside the door. Between me and it was less than 2 inches of old wood. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming as tears streamed down my face. Anna, the voice said, right on the other side of the door. Louder now. Insistent. Open up. It's cold out here. It was my voice. Exactly my voice. Same tone. Same inflection. But empty. Mechanical. The door handle slowly turned downward. The latch creaked, holding. The chair slid a few centimeters. Why won't you open the door? The creature asked. There was hurt in its voice now. A childish, petulant hurt. Grandma said you'd come. We were waiting. I backed down the hallway. My car keys were still in my jacket, and the jacket hung on the hook beside the door. I couldn't reach them. I was trapped. The door suddenly shuddered under a powerful blow. Plaster fell from the ceiling. Let me in, the voice shrieked, dissolving into wet gurgling. I ran. The only place to hide was the attic. The ladder was narrow and steep. I flew up it, slammed the hatch shut, and shoved an old trunk on top. Below me, wood cracked. The door gave way. I heard it enter the house. Heavy, wet slaps on the floorboards. The sound of dripping water echoed through the rooms like in a cave. It moved from room to room. It was looking for me. I crawled into the farthest corner of the attic, behind an old wardrobe, and curled into myself. Moonlight seeped through the gaps in the floorboards, and I could see part of the hallway below. A shadow slid across the walls. Long, distorted. Human-shaped, but wrong. Arms too long. Head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if its neck were broken. The creature stopped at the bottom of the attic ladder. It knew where I was. It could feel my heat. My fear. "I can hear you breathing," it whispered. The voice sounded muffled, as if coming from underwater. I stopped breathing. I pressed my hands over my mouth and nose, silently praying to gods I didn't believe in. It stepped onto the first rung. The wood groaned. Another step. I closed my eyes, waiting for death, imagining those swollen, icy fingers wrapping around my throat. The third step never came. Instead, I heard something strange. A rooster crowing. Distant. Hoarse. From a nearby village. Silence fell below. Then a hurried, shuffling retreat. Wet footsteps moving away. The broken front door slammed. I stayed in the attic until the sun climbed high and heated the roof so intensely it became hard to breathe. Only then did I dare to come down. The house reeked. The smell of pond scum, rotten fish, and stagnant water filled the air. The hallway floor was covered in puddles. Dirty, silted footprints led from the front door to the stairs and back. They were human in shape, but unnaturally elongated. I didn't pack anything. I grabbed my car keys from the floor where my jacket had fallen and ran outside. The sun was blinding. The heat had returned. I reached the car, but before getting in, I couldn't stop myself from looking at the well. The boards were back in place. Old. Rotten. Nailed down with rusted nails. The grass around it was dry and yellow. No mud. No water. As if nothing had happened. I froze. Had I dreamed it? Heatstroke? Dust and exhaustion? I stepped closer, feeling insane. I examined the boards. They looked untouched. As if no one had disturbed them in years. And then I saw it. On the underside of one board, where the wood met the darkness of the shaft, there was a clear handprint. Wet. Drying in the sun. On the inside. Someone had tried to hold the boards in place. From below. I got in the car and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the city, constantly checking the rearview mirror, terrified I'd see a dripping figure in the back seat. I sold the house a month later for almost nothing, without ever returning. I gave a realtor power of attorney and never looked back. But the story didn't end there. Sometimes, at night, when my apartment is completely silent, I hear it. Drip. 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 The sound of water hitting the floor. I check the faucets. They're closed. I check the pipes. They're dry. But I know that if I stand in front of the bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning, I won't see myself. I'll see her. The one that stayed in the well. The one that wears my face. And she's still waiting for me to come down. That's why I never sleep in total darkness. And you shouldn't either. Because wells don't exist only in abandoned villages. Sometimes the abyss opens right beneath your feet. All it takes is closing your eyes. I never believed that the dead could come back. but I know for certain that they can invite us to join them. That night, I saw him raise his hand in greeting. It was an ordinary gesture, almost mechanical, one I had grown used to over the course of a week. An old man in a padded jacket was waving to me from the window of the house across the yard. I was about to wave back, the way I did every evening, when my hand froze midair. Lightning split the sky over the lowlands, illuminating the courtyard for a fraction of a second. And in that flash, I saw the truth. The house wasn't there. There was no window frame. The old man was standing in empty space, his elbows resting on a charred beam suspended in midair, and behind him there was nothing but a black, rain-soaked sky. He was waving from a room that had burned down 20 years earlier. And he was smiling. What you are about to hear is not an urban legend or a campfire story. It is an account of events from October of 2012, one I am still afraid to reread in my diary. If you are alone in the room right now, you might want to turn on the light. This is a true story. That autumn, I was running from everything. From my divorce. From the city. From the depression that was suffocating me inside a cramped apartment in St. Petersburg. I needed silence, and I found it in a dying village near the edge of an old agricultural region, far from highways and cell towers. Calling it remote would have been generous. There were only 5 inhabited houses, scattered miles apart, separated by fields of dead weeds and washed-out dirt roads. I rented a room from an old woman named Vera. She was stern and quiet, her face wrinkled like a baked apple, her pale eyes always looking straight through you, as if focused on something far behind your head. The house itself was solid, built before the war, smelling of dried herbs, damp wood, and mice. My room faced an overgrown garden and, across a narrow road, the neighboring plot. The first 3 days passed in a blissful haze. I slept for 12 hours at a time, walked to the edge of the forest, and painted. The silence there was thick, padded, almost physical. The only thing that disturbed it was what I saw from my window at night. Across the road, hidden behind dense nettles and wild raspberry bushes, stood a house. During the day it looked gray and unwelcoming, buried in the shadow of massive oak trees. But at dusk, it came alive in a strange, almost cozy way. Every night, at exactly midnight, a dim yellow light appeared in the same window. It wasn't electric. It flickered, like a kerosene lamp. I saw him for the first time on my second night. I was sitting by the window with a mug of tea, staring into the darkness, when a silhouette appeared in the yellow square of light. It was a man. Judging by his outline, an old one. He wore bulky clothing, something like an old padded work jacket. He approached the window, stood there for a moment looking directly at my house, then slowly raised his hand and waved. The gesture was simple. Human. Warm. I smiled, suddenly embarrassed by how starved I was for contact, and waved back. The silhouette lingered for a few seconds, then disappeared into the depth of the room. The light went out. The next morning, over breakfast, I asked Vera casually. "Who lives across the road?" "That nice old man. He wished me good night yesterday." The clink of her spoon against the cup stopped instantly. Vera froze. She slowly raised her faded eyes to me. There was no fear in them. Only a heavy, leaden exhaustion. "Don't look over there, Lena," she said quietly. "He's not one of ours." "What do you mean, not one of yours?" I asked. "A summer resident?" "Don't look," she repeated sharply, slamming the kettle onto the stove. "And don't wave at him. Never answer. You'll invite trouble." I dismissed it as old-age superstition. Villagers often disliked outsiders or carried grudges no one else understood. Maybe the neighbor had stolen a chicken years ago. That night, I waited again. At exactly midnight, the light appeared across the road. The silhouette emerged. This time, he seemed closer to the glass. I could make out more details. A fur hat with one ear flap comically bent upward. He raised his hand again, the motion wide and welcoming. Despite Vera's warning, I felt compelled to respond. It was just politeness. I lifted my hand and waved. I thought I saw him nod. I went to bed feeling oddly content. In this forgotten place, I had a friend. Silent, but present. The problems began a few days later. The rain came down so hard that the road turned into an impassable swamp. We were cut off from the world. The electricity flickered and then went out completely. We lived by candlelight. The atmosphere in the house changed. Vera moved like a thundercloud. She covered the windows with thick cloth before sunset and locked the front door with 3 bolts, muttering prayers. "Why are you doing this?" I asked when she checked the locks again. "There's no one around for miles." "Some aren't around," she muttered. "And some are. You shouldn't have answered him. Now he knows you see him." That night, I couldn't sleep. Rain hammered the roof relentlessly. I lay staring at the clock. 11:55 p.m. 11:58. Curiosity overcame fear. I got up quietly, went to the window, and pulled the curtain aside just a little. The darkness outside was absolute. But at exactly midnight, the light across the road ignited. Now I saw him clearly. The distance felt shorter, though the houses hadn't moved. I could see the stains on his jacket, dark and uneven. But the worst part was his face. It was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze. Not on the house. On the narrow gap between the curtains. On my eyes. He raised his hand again. But this time, he wasn't waving. He was beckoning. His fingers curled and uncured. "Come here. Come closer." The movements were sharp and jerky, like a marionette with snapped strings. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my throat. For the first time, real fear took hold of me. This wasn't a greeting. It was an invitation into a trap. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough mysteries. The rain eased slightly, and I pulled on rubber boots and headed across the road. I wanted to see him in daylight. Look him in the eyes. Break the spell. Maybe he needed help. Maybe he was sick. The mud sucked at my boots as I crossed the road. There was no path leading to his property. Nettles rose in a wall taller than a person. Strange, I thought. How does he come and go? I found a stick and forced my way through the brush. Branches lashed my face. Water poured down my collar. After several yards, the vegetation suddenly parted. I stopped dead. The stick fell from my hand. Before me was a clearing of blackened earth. Burnt soil where nothing grew. In the center stood the remains of a stove. A brick chimney pointed at the sky like a broken finger. A few charred logs lay in the shape of a foundation. There was no house. There hadn't been one for a very long time. I stepped closer, unbelieving. The ground was mixed with ash and charcoal. A rusted bed frame, twisted by fire, lay where a bedroom might have been. I stood among the ruins, trying to reconcile what I'd seen at night with reality. I had seen walls. A roof. A window frame with glass reflecting lamplight. But here, there wasn't even a wall. I returned to Vera pale as a sheet. "The house," I whispered. "It burned down." She sat at the table sorting grain. She didn't look up. 1991, she said calmly. Old Mikhail burned with it. Drunk. Overheated the stove. Killed his family. Wife and daughter. All of them stayed there. But I saw him. I shouted. Every night. He waved at me. There was light in the window. Vera looked up then. The sorrow in her eyes was unbearable. The memory of the place, she said. Or demons playing tricks. I warned you. You looked. You answered. You made a connection. He thinks you're inviting him. Or asking to visit. That evening was the most terrifying of my life. I barricaded my bedroom door with a chair. I pulled the curtains shut so tightly not a particle of light could get through. I sat on the bed, arms wrapped around my knees, listening. I knew he was there. I knew it was midnight. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A creak. The sound of a window opening. An old wooden frame, dried and warped. But the sound wasn't coming from outside. It came from my room. I lifted my head slowly. The curtains were closed. The window was latched. I had checked it over and over. The sound came again. A creak. As if someone outside were pressing against the glass, searching for a gap. Then I saw the shadow. On the curtain fabric, backlit by moonlight, a silhouette grew. It was enormous. Far larger than it had appeared at a distance. The fur hat nearly touched the curtain rod. And the hand. The shadow of a hand rose slowly. Long, unnaturally thin fingers brushed the fabric. Scrape. Scrape. He was stroking the curtain from the other side of the glass. Luina, the sound was not a voice, but the rustle of dry leaves against stone. Neighbor. Come out. I was paralyzed. I wanted to scream, to call for Vera, but my throat locked. The shadow pressed its face to the glass. I saw the profile. A collapsed nose. A hanging jaw. Don't want to come out, it whispered. Then I'll come in. You called me. You waved. A thin, mournful chime filled the air. Glass cracking under pressure. But it wasn't my window. The sound came from everywhere. And then I understood. He wasn't outside. He was projecting himself. Using my attention as a bridge. The front door creaked. The very door Vera had locked with 3 bolts. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. The steps of someone whose boots were filled with water and ash. Squish. Drag. Squish. The smell of smoke flooded the room. Acrid. Suffocating. Burnt flesh and old rags. The footsteps stopped at my door. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and hid in the far corner behind the wardrobe. The handle turned slowly. The chair creaked, but held. Someone breathed on the other side of the door. A wet, rattling breath, as if lungs were full of fluid. Open it, the voice rasped into the keyhole. Look at me. You like to look. I squeezed my eyes shut until colors burst behind my eyelids. This isn't real. This is a dream. The pressure on the door increased. Wood groaned. And then everything stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. I stayed like that until dawn. Frozen. When the first gray light crept through the edges of the curtains, I forced myself to stand. The smell of smoke was gone. I moved the chair and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Vera was in her room, asleep or pretending to be. But on the floor, on the clean boards she had washed the night before, there was a trail. Black, ashy footprints. Bare feet. They led from the front door to my room. And stopped at the threshold. I packed in 5 minutes. I left money on the table and ran, slipping in the mud, falling, getting up again. I drove away as fast as I could. Only when I reached the highway did I allow myself to breathe. I checked the rearview mirror, expecting pursuit. The road was empty. I was safe. Or so I thought. A week later, back in the city, I developed a roll of film. Yes, film. I was chasing an aesthetic. The last photos were of the house across the road. I had taken them during the day when I first arrived. The pictures showed overgrowth. Bushes. Trees. No house. But on one frame, likely taken by accident while adjusting settings in the evening. Against the black forest, the outline of a house was clearly visible. Whole. Untouched. And in the window. My hands shook so badly I dropped the magnifying glass. In the window of the ghostly house stood no old man. It was me. My face twisted with terror, yet frozen in an unnaturally wide smile. And my hand was raised in greeting. I was waving at myself. Since then, I sleep only with the lights on. And I've covered every mirror in my apartment. Because sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I see movement in reflections. I see my hand lifting to wave at me, even though I'm sitting perfectly still. I left that village. But it feels like part of me, or something wearing my shape, remained there, in that burned house. And it's waiting for me to come back. So we can finally switch places. Good night.